Hello, my friends, and welcome to another week of Life and Stand Up with Pete Dominic. I had a wonderful last 4 days with my parents, Val, and the girls here at my childhood home in beautiful upstate New York. Been really relaxing. Everyone's had a great time together, eating real good food, playing games. We painted wooden Easter eggs, and my 15 and 18-year-old daughters almost killed each other doing an Easter egg hunt because there was cash hidden in each egg. It was really very funny. I should probably share some of the video of it. Speaking of cash, we are visiting Ithaca College today, where it looks like Ava might be hopefully a freshman in the fall. So if you like this daily podcast and haven't yet subscribed, please do that so we can afford to send her there. Have an awesome guest joining me today for the first time. Really fascinating guy who I'm very excited to share this conversation today with you. And then I'm going to be talking to him again about a separate issue, a different issue that he's an expert in next week because it went so well. His name is Eli Merritt. He is a political historian at Vanderbilt University where he researches the ethics of democracy and the interface of demagogues and democracy. He's got a new book out. He's got a Substack. He's real interesting, though, because he's got a BA in history at Yale, then a master's in ethics in Yale. And then, in a previous life, he was a psychiatrist for like 20 years. He got a degree from Stanford. So he's a super educated guy, but he is also someone who I can talk to about all kinds of psychological things. And after we got done talking about democracy, we then talked about psychiatry and all the issues that I'm interested in surrounding men and depression and addiction and suicide prevention, which he's an expert on as well. So I'm going to be talking to him again for a show next week. So really looking forward to that with Dr. Merritt, Dr. Eli Merritt, who joins me today. But first, just a heads up. Today is another abbreviated show, meaning I don't have all the bells and whistles because I don't have all of my gear and because I took some time off to spend with my family. And as scared as I am, I'm not putting out full, robust, comprehensive show with two guests, all the news and bells and whistles. I really do want to take time to spend with my parents whenever I can. And so the idea of spending my Easter Sunday working for hours in the afternoon and at night was just not something I was obviously going to be able to do. And I know that you understand and support that. So thank you very much. Also, I might not even have a show Tuesday morning because we're going to be on the road all day. And that's just going to be really hard to make happen. So I'll let you know. We'll see what happens. Maybe I'll be able to pull something off, but just a heads up. And finally, shout out to Kevin Richburg and his husband, Zach, who came to my folks on, was it Friday night, rather. We had a great time with them. And thank you to Jeremy Farrow, who just decided he would pay more for his subscription. Cynthia Wallace, welcome to the stand-up community. Derek Boyd has become a subscriber or resubscribed. Stephen Roth, Todd Hecker, and anybody else who is paying for a subscription to Stand Up with Pete Dominic. Thank you very, very much, including the great Jeff Jarvis. Jarvis is actually a subscriber to Stand Up, and I just want to give him a shout out because he posted over the weekend that sadly he lost his 98-year-old father. A couple listeners gave me a heads up about that. I have really been offline and blissfully unaware of what's happening in the world, but I do want to give Jeff a shout out and respect to him and his dad and his whole family. So sorry, Jeff, to hear of your loss. Daryl Jarvis died on Saturday, April 8th at 97 years old. And I just wanted to give Jeff and his whole family the respect. And also, like I said, I have not been paying attention, very close attention, certainly not enough to really talk about what's gone on with the legislators in Tennessee or what's happening with the abortion pill and Matt Taibbi and Substack and Twitter and so much more that is happening. But I will get back into it this week for you. And always good, though, to disconnect for a little while, isn't it, my friends? If you have that luxury, that is. Okay, well, with all of that said, I'm going to get to my conversation with Eli Merritt, who I think you're really going to like. I certainly did. Check out his Substack newsletter at American Commonwealth. That's the name of it. He's written for the LA Times, New York Times, and pretty much every important media outlet out there, as well as a whole bunch of medical journals, because like I said, he is also a psychiatrist. His new book is a great book of quotes, How to Save Democracy, advice and inspiration from 95 world leaders. I really like this. It's very, very good. Never take democracy for granted. Democracy is the people's government. Free and fair elections are the bedrock of democracy. Equality, inclusion, and diversity are cornerstones of democracy. Rule of law is the glue that holds democracies together, and so much more in How to Save Democracy. Dr. Eli Merritt joins me for the very first time on Stand Up right now.
Doctor, professor, so many titles, so many careers, now author. Dr. Merritt, welcome to the show. Thank you.
Great to be with you.
So I just have to ask you, as we get just to know a little bit about you, you're a doctor, a psychotherapist, the kind that could, you saw patients, you did therapy, you prescribed drugs, and then you decided you wanted to be a historian and specifically study authoritarians, demagogues, and democracy. And so you study history and politics, you get a degree there. Explain how that all plays out, because it really does give you a lot of credibility, I feel.
Well, it's true. I'm on my second career, and I originally majored in history as an undergraduate and was intending to go in the direction of, I think, constitutional law. But for complex reasons, I pivoted after college. I went into medicine. And as you said, I ended up practicing psychiatry, both as a psychotherapist and as a psychopharmacologist for 20 years, really with a specialty in psychotherapy, treatment of depression, most importantly. Then in 2018, 2 years after Trump was elected, I got the opportunity to go to Vanderbilt as a visiting scholar. And it really was a period of crossroads in my life. I was really going to figure out, was I going to pivot in the direction of writing history and political commentary and work basically being an advocate for democracy, or would I stay in psychiatry? I ended up pivoting. I think it wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the perceived dangers of Trump as president. So I grew up with a father who was a federal prosecutor from Middle Tennessee in the late 60s, and then he became a federal judge. So he was an important influence, I think, in my decision to pivot back to this democracy work and the writing of history. And the book you just showed is out. It's a more minor project. I also have a labor of years, a history book coming out in June called Disunion Among Ourselves, The Perilous Politics of the American Revolution. So I'm using my psychiatry and psychological knowledge in politics and history, but I've pretty much made the transition.
Yeah, well, I am looking forward to that book as well as I'm enjoying this one, a book filled with quotes about how to save democracy. So if your dad's a federal judge and former prosecutor, did that mean that you understood a lot of these things at a younger age? Democracy, the rule of law, was that the kind of thing he came home and was like, son, today we're going to talk about why democracy matters, or whatever he would do? I don't know.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely correct. So he was the primary influence in my life. My mother died when I was 6 years old.
Oh, God.
He was the head of the table, and he really, every night of the week, at least 5 nights a week, if not more, we had a family dinner. And let me tell you, I recently wrote a piece about on my Substack, American Commonwealth, but I grew up with a father who kind of had a preacher's spirit, but it was really about the Constitution and the rule of law. With the four of us at the dining room table, he would bring his hand down talking about the rule of law and the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. So I certainly was bred with a deep sense that the rule of law was sacrosanct. And look what's happening today. Right now, in fact, look what is happening. I'm sure we'll talk about this. Look what's happening to the rule of law. It is being demagogued, and disinformation is encircling the rule of law. It's very dangerous stuff. So yes, I'm using that spirit and the learnings from the dining room table with my father. Passed away a year ago, but the influence is still pretty profound within me.
I'm sorry to hear of your loss, both when you were 6 and recently, but that is a fascinating story of the impact that your pops had on you. And let me just give, sometimes us non-legal types, or even people who, like me, hear something over and over, kind of forget the meaning or the examples. So when we talk about this, we hear this all the time from folks like you, rule of law, and other people who care about the rule of law, which I think I care about, but maybe I don't understand what you mean specifically. Always, what's happening right now, and you can use Trump or anybody else as an example of how the rule of law is being what? Flouted, avoided, not respected. How do we give me examples of what's happening here or anywhere, I guess?
Well, I think discussing what's happening here is both pertinent and necessary. Well, the rule of law specifically causes us to envision the separation of powers in our government. And the type of rule of law we're talking about today with regard to Trump is sort of honoring that the judicial system operates on its own independently of the other branches of government. And unlike something like an impeachment and conviction and disqualification process within Congress, it's a political process. I actually feel strongly we shouldn't, demagogue that either. But the rule of law, it's been well established. It was Lincoln in 1838. He essentially said that the rule of law is and must be the political religion of the United States. If we can stick with that, the rule of law is our political religion, that's his language, we are going to be okay. And what we see now is, I'm sure you agree, Pete, that the worst problem we have right now in American society and our political culture is disinformation. But then disinformation can go in different directions. And we've been living for almost 2.5 years with disinformation about our elections. And now we're beginning to live with demagoguing and disinformation about the rule of law. And why that's so important, those two areas of disinformation are so dangerous is the House of Democracy and the model I adhere to stands on four cornerstones. One is elections, the will of the people. Another is the rule of law. The third one is checks and balances. And the fourth one, which is not discussed enough and is a fact of democracy, is ethical leadership. So we're messing with the cornerstone there. That's why it's so very important. And it is obviously the cornerstone or the instrument of government that it keeps the peace in the nation. So once again, the right-wing media and the Republican Party is not practicing forbearance about the rule of law, and they really should. Some are saying we need to let it take its course, and innocent until presumed guilty. He'll have his day in court, but you see others, including himself, demagoguing that it's really quite hypocritical, that this is election interference. But people believe that. They think that the origins of this are election interference. So that's why it's so dangerous, specifically with regard to the rule of law.
Well done. And I really appreciate that whole explanation. I was just thinking about this yesterday, how anytime some journalist is interviewing Trump or someone like Carrie Lake or any of these other people that are carrying on with their election denials, they don't always go right to, as you mentioned, the judicial branch, the rule of law, and say, listen, every single court, including courts that had judges appointed by Donald Trump, threw this out. They often do. They often get there. But to me, the concern, if that's their concern, Trump and his supporters should be on all of those courts, not on the elections themselves, but all of those courts that are throwing out every bullshit complaint that they come up with. How do you think is the most succinct way to argue with any of these deniers and say, listen, this is all you need to know to realize that the guy, it's a big lie? Is there any succinct way of trying, not that you will convince people, but that you would say is the best thing to say to people who buy the big lie?
That's a great question. And I don't have a good answer for that. And one of the reasons for it is that when people are in a state of delusion or paranoia, as I certainly discovered in 20 years of psychotherapy, it's very hard to penetrate with what we believe is fact or truth. So clinically, in those circumstances, there is the attempt to be a good listener. But this is a slow process, so I'm not advocating for that. I think what one could do in a case like this, where there's election denialism, is turn to something like the rule of law and try and emphasize, well, let's let that play out. And the challenge comes right now, of course, this is politically motivated. Therefore it's, to exaggerate, it's evil, although that's a feeling many people have. I mean, there's never been a time in world history and in histories of democracy where the rule of law is not filled with prejudice and bias of some kind. And I'm not necessarily referring to racial prejudice there. Human beings are biased. So even if this is politically motivated by Alvin Bragg or others, it actually doesn't really matter. It does not matter because bias is endemic to human beings. We still have to stand back and allow the rule of law to do its thing. You look at the O.J. Simpson case, et cetera, et cetera. Bad outcomes do happen. The judges are wrong. I lived with one my whole life. I could tell you all about my father strove to be objective, really did, but I could see some of his great prejudices. And by that, I mean he was always siding with the underdog. I mean, to a fault, to be honest with you. So that are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's good. Well, let me ask you, you talk about disinformation, and I do agree. I mean, I think the media, you talk to, and you're one of these experts, but a lot of experts on how authoritarians rise, they can't do it alone. And so they have to have institutions, they have to have maybe the military, they have to have military media. And what we see with Fox News and before that, long before that, radio, talk radio, led by people like Rush Limbaugh and still so many others, and now hundreds, if not thousands more, with huge audiences on the right, conspiracy theorists. I don't even call them right wing necessarily all the time. What we have is all of those things falling into place to help a Trump rise. How important is the media saying, we could pick singing the exact same song as the candidate, as the aggrieved candidate? If you have Trump saying the election was phony, you have all of vast majority of journalists and journalism checking it, fact checking it, courts, everything saying, no, we don't see it as actually a very secure election. Except for these networks and these personalities, how important are they of a piece? And what, if anything, is there of a solution to fight back against them other than countering them with our own media, I guess?
Well, the role of the media, as you say, I think a great starting point is Rush Limbaugh in the rise and destructive path of Trump is paramount, paramount, paramount. They have been the megaphone. Without the lack of ethical infrastructure and codes of ethics within the media, no chance Donald Trump ever would have been president of the United States. And I'll try to come back to talking about some solutions if there are any. But I'll say that the way this thing happens is well known in the history of democracy. What the favorite talk that I give is called Alexander Hamilton's Theory of Democratic Collapse. Presidents commence demagogues and end tyrants. So in brief, democracy is about, we know, free and fair elections. So the question is, who can get elected? So demagogues, through dark arts, through activating the baser instincts of human beings, through fear-mongering, through bigotry, unfortunately, can rise to power in democracies and can rise to the Oval Office. So I just want to clarify that demagogue rises to power, and then, as Hamilton said, and we know, power corrupts. So what happens when a demagogue gets corrupted? They are corrupted into deeper forms of demagoguery, but also into authoritarianism. And then what does the authoritarian do who has been elected by a democracy because the individual has skills of a demagogue in high office, takes a sledgehammer to the democracy itself, becomes authoritarian, and you can lose or severely debilitate a democracy. That is a fundamental mechanism that I think we all need to be studying in history and civil and civics. And just briefly on what can be done about unhinged demagogic media as well. Fox News is filled with demagogues. And I'm using this word over and over again because it's so important. It goes back to the beginning of democracy. Democracy was basically born one day, and the next day the word demagogue.
Yeah, I know you use it carefully. So how does one? Not everybody is necessarily a demagogue in your mind that we might think it. So what is an example? I know you're probably about to explain that.
Well, I think the most accepted way of understanding a demagogue, for one thing, is first we have to accept that the practice of demagoguery does exist on a spectrum of some kind. I think Trump is a 10 out of 10 in that spectrum. It's an individual who runs for office or is otherwise involved in democracy, such as media individuals, who uses bigotry, fear-mongering, scaremongering, and scapegoating to obtain fame and power for the self. And there is no, it's not hard to distinguish that the individual is not holding an authority of the Constitution or rule of law above the demagogue. Huey Long once said, "I am the Constitution around here." I think that pretty well encapsulates what the demagogue is. But with regard to the media, I do think we can expand limitations on the lifeblood of democracy, which is free speech. Europe is doing that. We have to evolve with the times. We have to adapt with the times and technology. So we can put further restrictions on incitement to violence, on hate speech, and defamation, which are things which are actually expanding as we speak today. And then we can just stand up. Schumer and Jeffries in the Congress on March 1st wrote a letter to Fox News saying beautifully, "We demand that you stop spreading this lie and that you tell the American people the truth and that you apologize to them." Now, they didn't do that. But the point is, enough momentum like that by the people, and in this case, I'm considering these two Democratic leaders of Congress to be the people, we can push for change. These kids just yesterday are protesting in Nashville.
Yeah.
Dissent is a cornerstone of democracy. I put it under that rubric of checks and balances. So we can dissent against Fox News. I won't go on too much longer. MoveOn.org has launched a campaign for people to stop spending their money on Fox News. Everyone should know who has cable TV, you are probably paying Fox News a couple of bucks. Every month of your money goes to Fox News because the cable companies won't unbundle them. So those are some examples. And I've quit my cable for that reason earlier. And I also copied Schumer's and Jeffries' letter. I wrote my own telling Rupert Murdoch and the others that I, Eli Merritt, demand that you stop spreading this lie.
Is it true also, Eli, that you write with an ink and quill by candlelight, which you also read by at night with a?
I really do. I do my best to imitate some of the founders in that regard. Well, no, I'm purely word processor these days.
Well, you talk about how we have to adapt and evolve you're arguing the solution is democracy, but that's also the problem. Like, so much democracy slows things down. It's very hard to get simple things done with such a big government. Easier, and I always encourage people to get involved in local government, but still hard. State level, it's hard. And as a result of how long it sometimes takes to get results for simple safety measures or benefits for people or closing a loophole that's exploiting someone, it takes a long time, and people get cynical and they get bitter. And in the meantime, they might get on the demagogue ride and be addicted to listening to that person and only become more embittered. It's just very hard. I'm not leading or driving into a question, just pointing out that it's so hard because of democracy to sometimes get things done. But yet, of course, I'm sure you have several quotes that will illustrate as to it being the best system.
The best system, and I think what you get into and what you're making reference to is polarization or hyperpolarization. And I think we miss how much you take demagoguery wherever it's coming from, and the way demagoguery interacts with polarization and polarization interacts with demagoguery. And then we get things worse with profit-fueled demagoguery in the media. We haven't talked about profit as being the dominant motive for so much of the demagoguery and disinformation that's circulating in our society. Rupert Murdoch all but admitted that with his quote, "It's not about the red or the blue, it's about the green." So all of these are potential areas of reform. But then again, you pointed out the gridlock prevents reform. Crisis tends to generate reform. And as much as we sit here today thinking, well, we've had enough crisis, Unfortunately, it is my belief that serious reform to our democracy, adaptation and advancement, innovation will not take place until we have worse crisis.
Well, I think it's got to be right, as illustrated by what you just said about all these kids in the Tennessee State House for the past few days. It's awesome that they're there, but they weren't there before the shooting occupying the State House. They're demanding now, and that's what the point is. That crisis hit so close to home that we've seen that happen throughout the country. So really important point and a great point. Let's talk about, though, what I think is the most important issue, and certainly you can tie it into democracy, that I hear from all the smart people I get the opportunity to interview, which is accountability. in this country, people like to talk about in recent history in our lifetimes, or maybe just before, Nixon being pardoned. You get the Vietnam War, you got the Iraq War, you got the financial crisis, you've got Trump and the elections. There's not powerful people too often don't get held accountable for destroying our livelihoods or our lives or the planet. Today, we have a little bit of accountability, a little bit of a justice with Donald Trump being indicted. He's been skating his entire life. Talk to me about accountability and democracy and why Trump's arrest or indictment matters.
Oh, it matters so much. And when you're describing that, I am reminded of the collection of letters that I love the most in existence in all literature and all history. And just briefly, it's called Cato's Letters. And it's not written by the Roman Cato, but it was based on the character of Cato. Two political scientists, basically, in the 1720s in England, wrote constantly about how to maintain Republican liberal forms of government. Now, this was after the Glorious Revolution. So by that time, Britain did have a weakened monarchy, and so it was a limited monarchy. In any event, I just wanted to make allusion to the word accountability that I hear so often. They didn't use that word. They said you have to punish people. And of course, parents know that. I mean, I guess we can use the term with our children, hold you accountable. I never did. I said, you're going to be punished for that. In any event, yes, wrongdoing of all sorts throughout all society in a democracy has to be punished. And I think the good news is I do think we need all of us to maintain the disposition that Trump is innocent until proven guilty. We must do that. That's a fundamental aspect of our form of government. But I think we can be quite assured that accountability is coming down the road for Trump from Special Counsel Jack Smith's office.
Yeah.
I hope the nation will be surprised, if not from Fani Willis in Atlanta. And so we have to, if both sides would practice forbearance about that and let justice take its course, it would improve our democracy dramatically. So I think the Democrats, for the most part, are doing this. The Republican Party, I sometimes believe today that it's corrupted itself beyond repair. And I think Liz Cheney's out there waiting, perhaps, to start a conservative party. And that gives me hope that potentially that will happen. We need ethical political parties. And the Republican Party has gone off the rails into a cult of personality around Donald Trump. I'm not sure how it recovers. It might.
I often hear people say the Republican Party of today is not a pro-democracy party. They're anti-democracy. They're fascist. There's all kinds of different terms. But when it comes to what you're writing about, what you're thinking about, how would you describe this Republican Party as, if you agree with that, as anti-democracy? The one idea that I think of is any single person who denies the outcome of the election that's in Congress, that has a vote to deny certifying the election, that's an example of anti-democracy. I think generally making it harder for people to vote is another example, and we can talk about that. But how do you define, what is this political party doing, if you agree, that makes them the anti-democratic party?
I agree with everything you've said, but the term that I prefer to describe what's gone so wrong, what's going so wrong in the Republican Party today is one we've mentioned, unethical behavior. Most of those folks, yes, there is a emotion-based greed for maintaining power, and I think there's an emotion-based desperation to hold their party together. It's like if you or I don't know if you have a family, Pete, but if we felt like we were about to lose our family, we would become desperate. We would be resorting to deep inner instincts of aggression. And I do think that if you look at Lindsey Graham and others, I think that the cult of personality within the Republican Party has gotten the best of them. So universal, unethical behavior. We have lost our constitutional norms. We have lost our democratic norms within the Republican Party. And that's the most simplistic way that, and again, come back to that model of what does it take for a democracy, the House of Democracy, to stand free and fair elections, rule of law, checks and balances, and also ethical leadership. So they've become demagogues, and they've been sucked into almost, the cult of Trump is stunning. We tend to think that, well, the base has been captured by the cult of Trump. Well, the whole party has. It's been a gradual process. So you just recently, I think it was only days ago, Asa Hutchinson from Arkansas announced. Yeah. I would recommend people pay a little attention to him. He is a more old-fashioned. If the Republican Party, if we could talk about the presidential nominating system, we should. If the Republicans had any sense and they wanted to actually potentially win against Biden, well, so far he is the candidate.
Well, I think
who can beat Biden. Trump will get trounced, but we have a very defective presidential nominating system as well.
Oh, you could name several, quote, moderate Republicans like Asa Hutchinson that would have a better chance. I agree with you, but I use Asa Hutchinson. I have been the past couple of weeks as a punchline, Eli, because I say, hey, do you want to know what Asa Hutchinson said today? Because I don't know if you noticed this, but all the network Sunday shows, especially, and the cable news shows, CNN for sure, they love to have Asa Hutchinson on to try to give a kind of credibility to reasonable Republicans. And so when I say, hey, did you hear what Asa Hutchinson said? The point is everybody's having him on and nobody cares. And the reason why nobody cares about Asa Hutchinson is because what you've been saying, this is my strong opinion, my very strong opinion. This is why I love your work and your book and all of your work. Ethical leadership. They don't want that. That's not their brand. They aren't ethical. And I wish I could find some way to split hairs or have some nuance with that. But I will never, ever be able to understand, or I will, and this is the point, that if the president, who'd been accused by so many women, who had this reputation about women in 2004, when I had the opportunity to meet him when I was in The Apprentice, and I said no, because I think he's a dirtball. That's why I don't want to meet him, because I knew that then. But if you didn't know that, and you heard the Access Hollywood tape, you could just grab women by their pussy, and everybody heard that. It was weeks before the election, and you still voted for him. What that points to is the opposite of wanting an Asa Hutchinson or a Joe Biden or anybody remotely ethical. It points to the fact that this is who many of us are. Do you see it another way?
I do see it another way. I believe that people are very vulnerable to, repeating again, demagoguery. It gets into people's souls. So here's what I believe. We made some fundamental mistakes in the early 1970s in the reform of the presidential nominating system. There were what we should identify as checks and balances against the rise of demagogues and authoritarians within the presidential nominating system of both parties. It was changed to a direct presidential primary in both parties. And while that sounds beautiful and pro-democracy, it's just not the real politics.
Not in the world of Rush Limbaugh and Fox News. I hear what you're saying. You instead of going, everybody gets their vote, you elect like delegates to represent you, and that person hopefully is a little bit more sane.
100%. You have to have checks and balances within the presidential nominating conventions that take place every year. Very few democracies around the world have primaries. Most of them have more complex systems.
Right.
So the parties put forth the candidates. So there are many ways that we could actually have democratic process take place. We would elect the delegates to the convention, not the candidates. And then the delegates go to the convention, and what do? They do their work. They become representatives of the people. And first and foremost, they develop a platform for the party. Second, going forward, I think we need to develop codes of ethics by which the candidate must adhere if that candidate wishes to remain in the party. And after that, after those things, they nominate the candidate who will best embody those values and principles. Now, because of these reforms, very, very pernicious reforms, we have someone like Donald Trump who can not only emerge into the presidential general election, but take the party hostage and convert the party into a cult of personality. I hope we'll learn from this, or some other democracy that's trying to develop itself somewhere will at least learn from the folly of what
you're saying. You're saying the system as it is in many other countries now, as it was in this country before in the 70s, is far more effective to limit these dangers that you're talking about. I also would imagine, I never thought about this, I'm sure you thought a lot about it, it would to some extent limit money's influence only in that you wouldn't have one billionaire bankrolling one candidate like Sheldon Adelson did in the past for, I think, Rick Santorum, and I think Ted Cruz had like two people bankrolling them, and they were contenders as a result. I mean, right now, you could have Peter Thiel or Elon Gold put $1 billion behind the pillow guy, and he would be a legitimate candidate, but for this system that you're describing, which would make that harder, I feel. But maybe it wouldn't. I don't know.
No, I think so. That reform plus some other intelligent reforms, but you're also pointing to the extreme problem of money in politics, and that's an area that should be reformed at the same time or part of this. There's a lot of talk. I've heard Biden say, "Cheer up, democracy is resilient," and that's right, but he's missing something. The history of democracy demonstrates democracy is resilient if we reform democracy. Democracy is not resilient. It doesn't autocorrect. When and how we're going to reform it, I'm not sure, but I actually think we should get out ahead. And even though people will look at me and say, "Oh, you could never get rid of the presidential primaries," I'd say, okay, fine, but let's get ready. Let's understand how we need to restructure our democracy for it to be a healthy democracy when that time comes, because we can get ahead of these things, and perhaps in a period of, I don't want this greater crisis, these smart reforms will take place. Actually, this summer at the Republican National Convention, some fascinating things could happen. People probably do not understand fully enough that the political parties are essentially under the regulation of no state law and no federal law. I mean, I don't mean to say they don't have to abide by certain laws, but they make their own decisions, is what I'm saying. So we might find, and at the beginning of the Republican National Convention, the first thing they do is they set the rules. They could set new rules that state anything they want, that the delegates this year can actually overturn the primary elections on the basis of constitutional issues or ethical issues. Anything's possible. So, and that might lead to reform of the presidential nominating system, which I would be very thankful
You
for.
mean, so just to be clear, you're talking about this summer, 2023, the rulemaking convention that will dictate the
2024. I'm sorry.
Okay, you're not. That's what I wasn't sure. Okay, so you're talking about
presidential nominating conventions will both be the summer of 2024.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go to them this year. I went to them every year. I covered them for CNN and Sirius XM, and I learned so much meeting all those people that were there. It's a very interesting.
I went to one. I worked for Al Gore's presidential campaign in 1988, so I attended that one. But so if you can figure out a way to go, Pete, ping me. I'd like to go with you.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll share a hotel room. It'll be super weird because we just met, but we'll save a ton of money. Well, before I let you go, there's so many other things I want to talk to you about, of course. But what is an example? I keep getting hung up on when you talk about ethical leadership or unethical leadership. It sounds like some ancient philosophy of some sort, and it's not a new idea. It's not an American idea. What are examples of that? Who do you see as ethical leaders?
Well, because
everybody has flaws, right? Everybody is flawed. Everybody is compromised.
Abraham Lincoln. The other thing I believe is that we human beings are not intelligent enough on our own to solve problems like we're in today. There's only one way we can solve them. History books. We've got to pull out the history books and let the history books be our guide. I really don't think human beings are rational enough and smart enough to solve problems like we're in now. So Lincoln for sure, MLK for sure, number of the founders, except for the dreadful, tragic blind spot about slavery within the political system, Washington and Jefferson, Washington and Madison stand out. But today, the person that stands out the most, so there's no appearance of partisanship, is Liz Cheney. She is extraordinarily ethical in the way she thinks about democracy. There's hope. Now, of course, she's weak as she can be, but it'll be interesting to see what exactly she's going to be doing. She is so determined to prevent the further corruption of our democracy that she's a great example of ethical leadership.
Well,
certainly.
I don't like your example. It's the first thing you've said that I don't like. And the reason for that is what I just said. Liz Cheney is not for reforming the campaign finance system. She wants as much money in politics, and she does not want to disclose it.
I'm not aware of that, and that would be a count against her. But we've come down to sort of the matter.
And I don't think she's for voting rights, reforming voting rights as well. Reinstituting Section 2 and Section 5. So I could be wrong about both those things, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. I'm pretty sure she has had the opportunity to fix both those major flaws in our democracy, and she hasn't. So I do not consider her. I don't agree with that example based on that, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, then we'd have to correct those things within her in order to hopefully. I'm looking at a conservative party, and there may be things about that emergence of a conservative party that you and I don't like it at all. But at least if it's struggling to keep our democracy afloat, we have to applaud.
Listen, if you want to destroy the administrative state, that's one thing. As long as you allow and encourage everybody to vote. If you're making it harder to vote, I don't care where you stand on any other issue. You are not an ethical leader in my mind. You can't do that. And you mentioned Dr. King. He fought and died for the Voting Rights Act. And any Republican, and so that's most Republicans, don't agree with reinstituting that, even though they all did under George W. Bush, including George W. Bush, every single Republican senator. It's only since Shelby County got struck down and this corrupt Supreme Court that all of these Republicans have said, why would we want to fix something that's helping us win elections, even though we don't have enough voters? I mean, that's how I see it.
I hear you on that. And your comment is going to cause me to do a bit more research on that particular aspect of Liz Cheney.
Well,
but I do hear this often, that we're going to judge folks simply on our perceptions or of whether or not they embrace expanding suffrage. And certainly that is a paramount matter in our democracy. But I think it's not the only one. So I wouldn't make determinations until we get to the final. Like, you're going to, whether it's Cheney or Trump, I would hope you would pick her, even though she has these flaws, if you were caught in that situation. So we're selecting folks where I'm judging her as ethical, perhaps without knowing the full details of what you brought up, within the context of her peers of Republicans.
Yes, there's within the context of her peers of Republicans, you definitely you'll get no disagreement from me there on the issue of upholding the outcome of the election. But that never struck me as brave. It never struck me as brave. Losing your election, especially when you're a Cheney, it's like one thing if someone's job depends on their health insurance, like the vast majority of Americans, where I don't blame them as much when they compromise their ethics with going to work for a company that is, providing their kid who's got a chronic illness with affordable health care. Like that guy, I understand a little bit more. When you have $1 billion in the bank and guaranteed health care and you're just trying to keep your $170,000 job, that does not strike me as impressive. Lose your power, lose your job, you're going to be just fine is how I see it, because that's my vantage point. Enough of my cynicism.
However, I will suggest to you that if it were that easy, more Republicans would do that. I do believe so. This phenomenon of moral courage and profile in courage, which JFK wrote about, he studied this within the Senate. And he found there are so few people who will stand up to their parties. So I agree with your assessment there, and it makes it a heck of a lot easier to have the support, financial and otherwise, that she has. Nevertheless, it still takes a lot of moral courage. And we know that because Mitt Romney, for example, is kind of doing it in a half enthusiastic way. So I don't know where she gets that moral courage, but it's a special thing.
Thank you so much for joining me. It's a great book. Your work is really interesting and impressive, and I've loved this conversation. I hope you will come back and talk again. Maybe join us in our classroom that we have like every Thursday night. It's not a classroom. It's really more of a bar hangout, but always lots and lots of listeners joining us. I'm sure I have a lot of questions for you. Keep up the great work, and I look forward to hearing more from you. I'm really, really psyched to have connected.
Thanks, Pete. Which convention should we go to?
The RNC is a lot more interesting in the antics and the kind of the people that you hear from. It's certainly a lot less diverse, of course. So yeah. I don't, from that standpoint, it's not as fun because it's a party atmosphere with the Democrats, but it's a party atmosphere with the Republicans too. But it's changed.
Explosive. I really do believe that convention could be explosive.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about that. I haven't heard anybody talk about what could change there. But, the bottom line is, and this is not what you're saying, I think, if The Republicans decided not to nominate Donald Trump because he's been indicted by every court in the land. He's still running. So if they nominated Asa Hutchinson or Ron DeSantis or Chris Christie, Donald Trump is still running. And now there's a threat of Joe Manchin maybe running.
He would run in a third party. We do know that. Unless he has a breakdown, which he probably won't. But
wait, we're talking about Trump?
Yeah, about Trump. I'll just say quick last word. I don't mean to keep you longer. No, but, Joe McCarthy, our most famous recent demagogue until Trump came along, he was an alcoholic. And so, sadly for him and his family, that's what enabled him to get out of politics. He sort of drank himself to death. And Trump is a teetotaler. And so I'm not sure what will happen. I mean, if he had some other vice other than demagoguery to turn to, he might do that. But he's dangerous because he doesn't have other places to turn.
Although there is a Ritalin shortage in the country right now, and I think that might be affecting him. I don't know.
Could be prescription medications, etc. Yeah.
Oh, I forgot who I was making.
I wish the man well. I just want him out of our politics. He needs a lot of help. Yeah. But we all just want him out of politics. He's in the wrong job.
I can't believe I just made like a Ritalin reference to a guy who could prescribe it. I didn't even realize who I was talking to there, but the rumor is he's always taken, some kind of a whatever. But that's a rumor. And I don't traffic in that. So, and I know you don't either. So I really appreciate this. This is really interesting. And I hope we'll see each other at the convention or somewhere else. I know you're also engaging in these democracy conventions, which are really cool. We didn't get to talk about, but people should get the book, go to your website, learn more, because this is such important work that you're doing. Thank you, Eli, for joining me.
Thank you, Pete. Great conversation.
And there he goes. Ladies and gentlemen, Eli Merritt for the first time. I'm very excited for it not to be the last time. We have already scheduled another conversation to talk about the other part of his career, psychiatry, and all of that. So looking forward to that. Definitely check out his Substack. Go subscribe to American Commonwealth and get his new book, everybody. It's really very interesting. How to Save Democracy. Advice and inspiration from 95 world leaders. Definitely check it out. I think you'll really, really like it. Eli Merritt, ladies and gentlemen. And that's all I've got for you today. Hopefully I'll be back tomorrow with a new show, but it might have to wait till, I don't know, like mid-afternoon on Tuesday, because I'm going to be traveling and it's going to be hard to tape a conversation. But thank you so much for listening today and for pressing play and for subscribing to this podcast. I know there's a million things that you can subscribe and everybody's asking you for money. So I really appreciate you so much. So grateful to you for listening and being a part of my world. All right, that's it. Be the change you want to see in the world that it is. And I love you, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. I hope. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up, you got to stand up, you got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. Point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. This is the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We got to let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake
leave the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up and show obedience to the voice inside. And listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.